Welcome to the Spotlight, and thanks for joining us. I'm David Rose. As you're about to see, many survivors of sexual assault in Washington state are a long ways away from getting justice. But progress is being made. The problems first surfaced publicly in 2014. That's when a nonprofit founded by Law and Order SVU star Mariska Hargitay began sending public disclosure requests to police agencies across the country. They wanted to know how many untested sexual assault kits they had. The Seattle Police Department responded that there were more than 1,200, and that kicked off a statewide conversation.
It confirmed that we had a system that was broken, that, one of the first things I had asked law enforcement is, how would you ever catch a serial rapist?
During the January 2015 legislative session, State Representative Tina Orwall sponsored a bill requiring all backlog sexual assault kits to be tested. But first, an audit would be done to find out how many kits were sitting in evidence rooms across the state. The results were staggering.
What was happening, which is tragic, is that those kits were sitting on shelves all across our state. They were not being submitted for testing. Each one of those kits is a survivor's story.
More than 10,000 untested kits gathering dust. Snohomish and Pierce counties each had more than 1,000 kits, some more than a decade old. State Attorney General Bob Ferguson telling the Spotlight the results lit a fire under him.
The way I look at it is, what if it was my kid that happened to? I know I'd be outraged if her sexual assault kit was sitting on a shelf somewhere in some office and nobody seemed to give a damn. And so that's really what motivated me personally, that, hey, I knew there were thousands of these stories out there, thousands of those victims, and to do what we could with the resources we had to try to help.
In 2017, the AG's office was awarded $3 million in grant money to start the Washington State Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, an ambitious project aiming to reduce the backlog to zero and speed up the testing of new kits.
Not only did we want to test every kit, but we wanted to set up a system that would support survivors, that would rapidly test kits, so this would never happen again.
It's a two-prong approach, overseen by the Washington State Patrol's Crime Lab. 3 private labs have been approved to handle the backlog of kits. The Crime Lab assigned local law enforcement agencies to each private lab. The local agencies send their kits directly to the labs. The labs process the kits, then send the results to the State Patrol Crime Lab. The Crime Lab analyzes the results. If a DNA profile is found, the State Patrol uploads it to the FBI's Combined DNA Indexing System, better known as the CODIS database. As of April 7, 2022, 9,606 kits have been submitted for testing. 6,234 kits have been fully tested. Of those, 2,541 have produced usable DNA. That doesn't mean an assault didn't occur in the other 3,000 plus cases. It's possible the attacker wore a condom, didn't leave DNA behind, or that by the time the samples were taken, there was no DNA left. Of the 2,500 DNA samples that have been uploaded to CODIS, there have been 1,400 hits. More than 1,100 linked to offenders whose names and identities are listed in the database, while 270 have matched to other cases, meaning the attacker is a serial rapist who is still on the loose. While the private labs are chipping away at the backlog, a new high-throughput lab in Vancouver, Washington is handling recent cases.
We said, what we want to see is every sexual assault kit tested within 45 days. Tell us what you would need to make that happen.
High throughput means that computers and robotic equipment do most of the lab's work, freeing up time for the 11 scientists who work at the lab to do what humans do best: investigative analysis and problem solving. The scientists extract a DNA sample from the sexual assault kit, put it inside of a special tube that the robot is able to open, and then the scientists walk away. The computer-run robotic equipment handles mixing the chemicals and doing all of the readouts and printouts, tasks that used to take up most of a lab scientist's time. The high-throughput lab receives an average of 211 kits each month sent in by agencies across the state. By law, the kits need to be sent to the lab within 30 days from the time they are collected and processed within 45 days of arriving at the lab.
To submit yourself to one of these tests, it is very invasive. It is not easy, and that's putting it mildly. And we need to do our part to honor, that person who's gone through that experience, to make sure we preserve that evidence, get it tested, and then importantly, at the back end, start finding the people who committed these acts and put them away.
When it comes to prosecuting a case, that examination is crucial evidence in the investigation. So to learn more, we turn to Terry Stewart, the Health Program Operations Manager at Harborview Abuse and Trauma Center.
The time with the nurse can be anywhere from about 2 to 4 hours, but patients, when they present to one of our hospitals through the Harborview SANE team, they are first seen by a social worker who sort of assesses their needs and provides immediate medical advocacy. And they're also seen by an emergency department medical provider to make sure that there aren't any more serious issues. So generally, patients should expect to spend between 6 to 8 hours in an emergency department when they present for an exam. This is the rack that we use to store the swabs once we've collected them. This is the Washington State Evidence Collection Kit. All the kits in the state are tracked under a state tracking system, so patients will know where their kit is in the process of being tested. And there are 15 different steps in the evidence collection kit, and what we collect is dependent upon the history that the patient provides, as well as the patient's preference and what they would like us to do for them at the exam. Everything is really determined by what the patient wants and guided by the patient's choices. So a police report is not required in order to receive the forensic exam. The exam, the medications provided, any diagnostic imaging that we need, and the evidence collected is provided free of charge through the Washington State Crime Victims Compensation Program. If a patient presents to the emergency department and wants a report to be made, they can be assisted by ED staff. Social workers typically will help them make a report, but again, it's not required in order to receive the services. The forensic nurses are really most interested in making sure patients get the appropriate medical care they need.
The problem is you can't just walk into any hospital across the state and find a nurse trained in the SANE program right now, but that is changing thanks to the tireless efforts of one woman from West Seattle. There is now federal funding that increases nationwide access to trained nurses who can perform sexual assault exams. The Spotlight's Hannah Kim is here with the story.
When I talk about systems that harm people,
Leah Griffin is a rape survivor.
Really, sexual violence is not being prosecuted in a way that has a meaningful impact on public safety.
Griffin says the man who raped her in 2014 was never prosecuted because she was turned away from a Seattle hospital that didn't do rape kits.
Out of 1,000 rapes, the Rape and Incest National Network estimates that 0.5% of those rapes result in a perpetrator spending even a day in jail.
The shock turned into anger, which morphed into determination.
So it's been a lot of work and a really long journey.
She began to tell anyone who would listen to her story.
And I understand that.
Eventually, it traveled to Senator Patty Murray.
When Leah first told me this happened to her, I could hardly believe it.
And the two would start working together on legislation.
A rape kit is not just a box of swabs, it is a multi-hour-long process that requires the collection of DNA evidence, that requires photographic evidence, that requires a lot of things of nurses that nurses don't typically do.
Meaning it's expensive. Nurses have to be trained not only on how to gather forensic evidence, but also how to give expert testimony if a case goes to court. Evergreen Health in Kirkland says they've invested in sexual assault nurse examiners, or SANEs. But they know many other hospitals and clinics don't have access. For adult survivors, it's ideal to get an exam within the first 120 hours of an assault.
And the programs are so few and far between that so many people have to travel long distances to get those services.
According to this 2016 study provided to the legislature, the exact number of SANEs is unknown, but it points out a deep divide between rural and urban areas in Washington, saying at that time the 1.5 million rural county residents were at a disadvantage. Griffin says she's had people she doesn't even know reach out to her, desperate for advice.
To say, I need help, I don't know what to do. I'm in the ER, I've been waiting for hours, what should I do? And the idea that people are reaching out to me instead of having a system in place to adequately treat people is wrong.
But for the first time, Griffin can say things are about to get better after all these years.
About 7 years.
That's a long time.
Turns out it's really hard to pass federal legislation.
But you did it.
But we did it. And
how does it feel?
It's the achievement of a lifetime. It is a lot of work to be a person in Seattle, doing everything that I can to tell my story, to amplify the stories of other community members.
In March of this year, Congress passed provisions of the Survivors Access to Supportive Care Act, and with it, around $150 million over 5 years will be going to expand SANE programs across the country.
Everyone should know that during an unimaginably traumatic time, they can get compassionate care from well-trained providers.
We've got a lot done.
One local woman's pain channeled into action, now leading to nationwide access.
Now, for the first time, we're going to have national standards of care in hospitals to ensure that when a survivor comes in, they're taken care of.
So Hannah, now that the legislation is passed, what's next?
So the next step will be to allocate the funds, and it's going to be done on a competitive basis. We don't have an exact breakdown because they haven't done that part yet. So for example, we don't know how much, say, Harborview versus Evergreen Health is going to get compared to, say, other hospitals in other parts of the country. But again, David, $151 million doled out over 5 years.
This seems like a no-brainer. Why did this take so long?
So David, the reality is that, to pass any federal legislation, it's complicated and it takes a lot of lobbying. And in this issue, it seems like awareness was lacking in many ways, because Leah was telling me that she'd come across people who just did not know that rape kits were not readily available at many hospitals. And also you find that policy follows along with cultural trends. And I say that because Leah says that before the Me Too movement, a lot of people dismissed her story, but after the Me Too movement, she says people would actually listen to her.
Thanks, Hannah. As of now, there have been roughly 2,500 DNA samples from the backlog in Washington State uploaded to the FBI's CODIS database. 1,100 returned hits to known offenders. So are more than half of our rapists first-timers? Probably not. It turns out thousands of convicted felons in our state alone have not submitted their DNA that they owe by law to the database. I sat down with Lindsay Wade, a retired Tacoma Police homicide detective and former investigator with the Washington State Attorney General's office. She says she was stunned to learn that many known sexual predators were not in the database. What is CODIS in layman's terms?
So CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System. It is a national DNA database that's run by the FBI, and each state has their own database that they run, and then there is the national database run by the FBI. CODIS contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders. It also contains DNA profiles from crime scene evidence, such as evidence from sexual assault kits or evidence collected at a homicide scene. It also maintains DNA profiles from missing persons, relatives of missing persons, and unidentified human remains.
When did you first notice there was a problem with missing DNA in our CODIS database?
It was about the end of 2010. I was a detective at that time with Tacoma Police, and I was investigating a cold case. And I was on the phone with somebody from the Special Commitment Center. And we started talking about the offenders out there who are sexually violent predators. And I asked whether or not everyone out there on the island, out of McNeil, had their DNA in CODIS. And the answer that I got was, we're not sure. Let me look into that. And after some further digging, I found out that there were over 40 sexually violent predators out on the island that had never had their DNA collected. And these are, the state's worst of the worst. These are, sexually violent predators who, in most cases, serve their prison sentence, but have been deemed too dangerous to be released into the community, and so then they get civilly committed. What I learned at the time was that their policy was to collect DNA from people upon release, which didn't make a lot of sense to me, especially as a cold case detective, because some of these people would never get released. Therefore, you've got all these potential cases that these people could be linked to that no one would ever have the answers to. So it was about the same time when I first discovered that Ted Bundy's DNA was not in CODIS, which was...
That's mind-blowing.
I know.
The serial killer, sexual predator Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
I mean, the average person would think for sure they have his DNA in the system.
Right. And I think for many years that was just the assumption, right? Because he's like the most notorious serial killer in history.
At 16 minutes after the hour, the country's most notorious killer was dead by electrocution.
How could his DNA not be in CODIS? Because he was a cross-country offender and, killed upwards of 30 plus women. But the bottom line was, what I found was that he was not in CODIS in our state because he didn't have any convictions here in Washington, even though he was suspected of committing multiple murders here. And then where he was executed in Florida, he also did not have a DNA profile. And so that was, like you said, mind-boggling to find that out.
How did you clear him or confirm him as a suspect in your case?
So we never really could. It was a very long process working with the state of Florida to try to track down a sample of Ted Bundy's DNA, which ultimately was accomplished in 2011. An old vial of his blood collected back in 1978 was located, and a DNA profile was developed from that old crusty blood vial. The case that I was working on at the time was the disappearance of 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr from 1961. And although we had high hopes that some of the evidence collected by the original detectives in 1961 might yield some biological evidence, what we found was that the lab couldn't come up with any DNA on the evidence that we submitted. So we really couldn't rule Ted Bundy in or out.
What has been done to fix this going forward?
It is a very complicated issue because if you're looking at it from a statewide perspective, like how do you figure out how many people in Washington state owe DNA? It's not an easy question to answer for a variety of reasons. Not everyone that gets convicted of a qualifying offense goes to prison. So you can't just rely on Department of Corrections information. And there are various ways that people can slip through the cracks, either because they got released from prison before the DNA law took effect, or they may have died in prison before the DNA law took effect. Some people get convicted and never go to prison. And so somehow between, getting sentenced and getting released, they're missed. They're not having their DNA collected.
The challenge then now again is just so I'm clear, the DNA has been collected from those people who are in prison, those people who are convicted sex offenders. That DNA is now in the CODIS system. But how many others are out there, maybe the level 1 sex offenders, or others who didn't have their DNA collected when they left court? How many others are out there right now that we know of?
Thousands.
So thousands of potential predators on the streets right now that there's no record of to match them to any other potential victims.
Right.
And how long was this going to go on, do you think?
I think it's going to be years before we can address the people that are out in the community that are walking around that have never had their DNA collected. And then that's not even talking about people that are deceased, right? We've got thousands of offenders that are deceased in our state that never provided DNA. And while they won't ever be charged with a new crime, it would be very helpful to have their DNA in the database so that if they are responsible for a cold case, the victim's family could get some answers and get justice, at least know what happened or who did it. And also, on a resource level, do you really want taxpayers paying for detectives to spend hundreds of hours working on a cold case, or thousands, in some cases, when the answer could be right there?
We will continue to track efforts here and across the country to update the CODIS database. In the meantime, we're showing you some training that you can use to keep from becoming a victim.
Joanne Factor is the creator of Strategic Living. For decades, she's been teaching local women on how to protect themselves.
First choice, run. Okay, always first choice. If you can get away safely, do it.
But Factor says if you cannot get away and you are in imminent danger, fight back.
No! Back off! Leave me alone!
A loud voice like that can be your first self-defense tool. And items that you carry around every day is your arsenal, starting with your cell phone.
Well, a cell phone, how much damage can a cell phone really do?
Well, the whole point is to pick the right targets, to pick vulnerable targets like soft tissue, eyes, throat.
Joanne says even a pen and your keys can be better than nothing if you attack those vulnerable targets.
So what sometimes people have heard in the past is they kind of lace their keys between their fingers like this. Don't do that.
Why?
Because it's not very stable. You're probably going to hurt your hand.
Instead, she says do it like this.
Just hold this one key. You'll be a lot more stable. You'll have better aim. right into the eye.
Eyes, ouch.
Yeah, right into the throat.
Another tool she loves to carry around is a flashlight.
I think every human in the Pacific Northwest needs a flashlight.
You could use it to blind your assailant for a second and also use it as a weapon.
My finger's already on the trigger.
Another popular thing for women, pepper spray.
And my only concern being a new user is that I'm going to use this on myself accidentally.
That's why Factor says it's important that you practice. For our demonstration, she let me use a practice spray filled with water.
Go into your backyard, get an old Halloween mask, put the old Halloween mask up in your backyard, take this out and do some target practice.
Also, if your pepper spray is in your purse, it's no good. Factor says hold it in your hand with your finger on the trigger when you are out and about in places where you don't feel safe.
Oh wow, and that goes far.
So think about specifically, what would I do? So if I'm passing somebody on the street, what would I do? If I'm in the elevator with one other person, okay, and that person turned around and attacked?
It's uncomfortable to think about, but Factor says role-playing and planning out what you would do in certain situations could make a huge difference in how you react during a real attack.
We need to apologize. The state failed survivors, and I know we're committed to making it right, but I think we need to acknowledge that, and I think we need to offer supports and help those people that are now trying to move forward.
Finally tonight, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and there are multiple resources available if you need them. Just call the National Sexual Assault Hotline, 800-656-HOPE. It will automatically direct your call to the nearest sexual assault service provider. There are 27 total in our state, so there's one near you. Again, that number, 800-656-HOPE. To see this information, go to fox13seattle.com. Thank you for joining us as we shine the spotlight on getting justice for sexual assault survivors. Until next time, be smart and stay safe.